What if the biggest obstacle standing between you and the life you want isn't failure? What if it isn't a lack of talent or a lack of opportunity? What if the real obstacle is something much more personal? What if it's the version of yourself you've become comfortable with being? Because sometimes the hardest thing a person can do isn't starting over, it's letting go of old labels, letting go of old identities, letting go of old assumptions, letting go of old stories. And that's what we're talking about today, the fear of reinventing yourself. Welcome back to the Hero Hour, the podcast about transformation, resilience, identity, and rewriting the narratives that shape our lives. I'm Nathaniel D. Borey. Over the past few episodes, we've talked about the stories we inherit, or as I like to call them, inheritives, why people stay stuck, and why failure is not the end of the story. Today, I want to talk about something that often happens after all of those realizations. A moment when a person begins to understand, I don't want to keep living as the person I've always been. That realization can be exciting, but it can also be terrifying because reinvention isn't just changing what you do, it's changing who you believe you are. What most people think they fear is change. I don't think that's entirely true. People change all the time. Jobs change, technology changes, relationships change, circumstances change. What people often fear is identity change because identity feels personal. It feels permanent. When you've spent years seeing yourself one way, imagining yourself differently can feel uncomfortable, even when the change would improve your life. The familiar version of yourself may not be perfect, but at least it's known. At least it's predictable. And human beings are naturally drawn towards what feels familiar, even when familiar isn't serving them anymore. Think about some of the labels people carry. I'm shy. I'm not creative. I'm bad with money. I'm not leadership material. I'm not athletic. I'm not confident. Sometimes these labels begin as observations, but over time, they become identities. And eventually, people stop questioning them and they start defending them. They protect them. They build entire lives around them. But the strange thing is that many people secretly want to escape these labels. But escaping them requires becoming someone unfamiliar. And that's where fear enters the picture. Because every reinvention begins with uncertainty. Another reason reinvention is difficult is because it doesn't just affect us. It affects the people around us. Every person in your life has a version of you in their mind, a set of expectations, a story they've come to believe about who you are. And when you begin to change, you challenge that story. Sometimes people celebrate your growth. Sometimes they celebrate your transformation. But sometimes they resist that change, not because they're bad people, but because change forces them to update their understanding of you. And that's uncomfortable. The truth is that some people will always prefer the version of you they're familiar with, even if that version is holding you back. Something people don't talk about enough is that reinvention often involves loss, not necessarily the loss of people, but the loss of identities, the loss of old assumptions, the loss of versions of yourself that once felt important. Sometimes we have to let go of dreams that no longer fit. Sometimes we have to release beliefs we've carried for years. Sometimes we have to stop defining ourselves by experiences that happened long ago. And that process can feel surprisingly emotional because even unhealthy identities can become familiar companions. Letting them go can feel like saying goodbye. One of the biggest myths about transformation is the idea that people become confident first and act second. In reality, it's often the opposite. Most people don't feel ready when they begin something new. They don't feel fully confident. They don't feel certain. They don't feel prepared. They don't, they simply decide that growth matters more than comfort. And through action, confidence begins to develop. Belief begins to grow. Momentum begins to build. The person they hope to become slowly starts becoming real. Not because they waited for certainty, but because they moved without it. One reason hero stories have endured throughout history is because they reflect something deeply human. Every hero eventually leaves the familiar world. They leave certainty. They enter unknown territory. They face challenges. They change. And by the end of the story, they're no longer the same person they were at the beginning of the story. That's the journey, not just in stories, but in life. Every meaningful transformation requires leaving something familiar behind. The question isn't whether change feels uncomfortable. The question is whether the life waiting on the other side is worth that discomfort. Maybe you're listening today and you feel called towards something different, a new career, a new goal, a new dream, a new chapter, a new version of yourself. But maybe part of you is scared. Maybe part of you is scared of failing. Maybe part of you is scared of judgment. Maybe part of you is scared of uncertainty, scared of becoming someone unfamiliar. If that's where you are right now, I want you to remember something. You don't have to become a completely different person overnight. Transformation is rarely dramatic and it's not automatic. More often, it's gradual. One decision, one habit, one act of courage, one choice at a time. The future version of yourself is built through small actions repeated consistently. And every transformation begins with permission to change. So here's this week's Heroes Challenge. Take a few minutes and write down one identity you've outgrown. Maybe it's I'm not confident, I'm not capable, I'm not creative, I'm not a leader. Whatever it is, write it down. Then ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if I let this identity go? Now be honest with yourself, because hidden inside that answer is often the fear that's keeping people from becoming who they want to be. Reinvention is not easy. It requires courage, patience, humility, and a willingness to become unfamiliar to yourself for a little while. Every meaningful transformation begins the same way, with a single decision. A decision to stop allowing old identities to define future possibilities. A decision to embrace growth. A decision to step into a new chapter. Because the person you become tomorrow is not limited to the person you've been until today. Thank you for spending another hero hour with me. Until next time, be the hero of your own story. And as always, rewrite the narrative.